Hi, so we are here talking about hope and suffering. Talked more about suffering last week. I'll probably talk a little bit more about hope this week. Although really the two concepts, they're sisters, right? They really go together, and really quite intrigued by the Green article from last week on hope, and then the Roxburgh et al. Article this week having to do with suffering and the tsunami in the Indian Ocean in 2004 and the Book of Job. And there's just a lot to kind of weave there together, and certainly within a healthcare context, you're going to face these kinds of issues. So I think this week I want to do something a little bit different, in that my comments about the biblical text will be a little bit shorter, and then comments about these two articles will be a little bit longer. I don't mean to take us off of your reflections on the articles, or to skew the thread of discussion in a way that's not productive, but with these two articles, I thought maybe this would be a good week to kind of show you how I read those kinds of articles, and certainly I would be interested in your take on that, because you may read them very differently than I do, and so the conversation ends up being a very productive one. So, going backwards for a moment to the Green article, and I've talked about this in other contexts, so. Maybe this is repetitive for some of you that have actually sat in class with me. For those of you that are taking a class completely online, you might not have had that kind of exposure. But when I read the Green article, there were a couple of things that kind of kept hopping out to me. One is, going back to what I talked about last week, what really is suffering? How do we define that? Is suffering pain? Is it disease? Or is it something else? And so that's one question that kind of hops out at me. The other question is about hope. Is there kind of a couple of questions going together here with the Green article? Green seems to only want to define hope one way, and is that the only way of understanding hope? Is the way she writes it and the resources that she draws on, is that the only way to think about hope? And certainly the focus on what she is dealing with in that article has to do with the futility of life, that no matter what we do at this point going forward, there's not going to be any hope of a turnaround. Well, as a Christian, I think hope does kind of spring eternal. There always can be hope, and yet the kind of hope she refers to in dealing with these parents who have desperately ill children in the NICU, it's not necessarily the kind of hope that I would encourage, or did encourage when I was a pastor, or would encourage in the future, even if it was one of my own grandchildren, for example. So how I deal with this is kind of tinged with my own experience in pastoral ministry, my own thoughts about the scriptures, and maybe looking at some things that Green didn't take full accounting of. And that's okay. I mean, that's part of why we do this, and it's part of how we do this. We put something out there, and then we leave it for others to come back and help us adjust our thinking. So that's what we're going to do in the next little bit. I'm going to return with the second video and kind of dig into Green, and maybe that will prompt our conversation about hope and what that is from from a biblical perspective, and if that's helpful for you as you think about your own practice area.